So much. I'm just going to share my screen. And I will just also say before I start that Suzanne is on the call with us, listed as Lloyds Bank Foundation, sorry, who has been working on this with myself and Francis and the team at NEF. Can everyone see my screen? Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. My name's Dr. Abby O'Connor. I'm a researcher at the New Economics Foundation. I'm a sociologist. I specialise in qualitative research with communities, with a background in land and housing and community activism and organisations. So today we're going to talk to you about a large project that we've been running since kind of around last August. Which has been around understanding the distinctiveness and the value of by and for organisations and how funders can better support them and the opportunities that they offer in particularly turbulent times. So I'm going to talk through the kind of the research design today, a little bit of background and how we went about it, because we chose quite a specific methodological design for this, but rooted in our principles at NEF, and then talk through some findings, and then a bit of information around planned outputs and where everyone can see a bit more from the research once it's all been published fully. So just a bit of background for anyone that doesn't know, the New Economics Foundation is a think tank based in London. I'm based up in Liverpool. My colleague Francis, that is our team leader, she's based down in Totnes. So we've got people kind of all over the country, but predominantly NEF work on issues of social inequality and developing policy recommendations at both local, national and regional level to try and combat some of the inequalities that communities are experiencing. So I just thought we'd kick off this with just a very nice quote from one of our participants that I think summed up a lot of the work that we're doing there. I can't see anyone's faces, so if someone wants to say something or you want me to repeat, please can we just speak, because I can't see anyone. But just to kick off then, as a bit of a flavour of the work, one of our participants shared a big part of campaigning and organising is imagining the world as it should be. I have to imagine the world as it should be in order to know the world I'm trying to get towards, and I can only do that with my community. And we thought that very nicely summed up so much of the work that we've done in communities over the last kind of 10 to 12 months. So just a bit of research background, and I will try and keep this as quick as I can so we can have time for discussion, which is always the most fruitful bit. So this research was commissioned by Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales and the Legal Education Foundation. And they've done a lot of work already around the value of small charities and by and for organisations. There's a huge amount of work already out there, many of whom on this call I'm sure have been involved with. And this project was also supported by a research advisory group that was put together by Lloyds Bank Foundation in order to kind of support the research through the length of the project and before we were commissioned on it. So they helped design the research, and this advisory group was made up of 9 individuals that have lived experience within organisations throughout England, Wales and the north of Ireland, actually. And then at NEF, the team that we're leading on this is our Community Economic Power team. And the whole premise of the project was to look at the characteristics and distinctiveness of by and for organisations. So we've been working on this for over the past year, and I'll talk a bit through kind of how we did that work. But just broadly speaking, we employed 4 peer researchers as part of the work, and did research with just under 100 individuals from by and for organisations across England and Wales. England and Wales was our remit, and we were looking at how they work through, as we've said here, creative solutions to meet the needs of their communities. And also really what we really wanted to do as NEF was look at how we could really shift the funding landscape to think really carefully about how funders and policymakers and others engage with these communities on the ground and meet them where they need to be met. Okay, so just a brief kind of bit of context that will be of no surprise to anyone, but I thought it would be remiss not to mention this. Of course, we've seen inequality and injustice accelerate significantly in the last kind of 5-10 years in the UK, and there's been a massive interest in buy and for organisations. We saw this a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which community organisations, of course, played a really crucial role in responding to challenges. But kind of most prevalent for this work is that during the course of this research, of course, over the summer of 2024, we saw racist riots take place across the country, and many of the organisations involved in this research and individuals involved in the advisory group and myself, in my capacity as someone that works in communities, were involved in responding to those riots in various different ways, whether that be through the services that their organisations offer, or for me on the ground in Liverpool, we were doing a lot of work with communities in that. And I think it's really important to mention that landscape, because it certainly had an impact on some of the issues that we were talking about in the research. And that it was a hugely difficult time, and continues to be a difficult time for many of the communities that we work with. But again, it was another reminder of just how vital these communities are in supporting one another, and also in many ways in filling a gap that previously existed by a much more functioning welfare state, which of course post austerity doesn't exist in the same way anymore. So just briefly then, the objectives of the research, firstly was to improve funders and policymakers' awareness and understanding about the role of buy and for organisations through compelling evidence, which speaks to kind of how we design the research, to increase sector-wide understanding about user and equity-led organisations through investigating the small, local and specialist characteristics of them, and to produce a set of recommendations about practice and policy changes that can better support buy and for organisations. And from this, we had 3 broad research questions that were broke down into sub-questions, but I'm not gonna list them all here. But broadly, it was, how do we describe and define what a buy and for is, which was a much more difficult question than I anticipated. What are the distinct qualities, roles and values of buy and for organisations, and what are the challenges that these organisations face? I just wanted to talk briefly about research principles for us as NEF. And for us as researchers, this was really important to us. So the objectives and the questions were devised when we bid for this work. So we wanted to bring in, our own approach to it, and how we approach things in our community power team at NEF. So we designed our methods, our methodology around 3 kind of key principles. One, it being a participatory approach, so really building in understandings and experiences of those on the ground. Whilst Francis, my colleague, and I work in communities, we are not, we're working in a large think tank. We're not on the ground every single day, and we understand that the people closest to that have the most experience of that and knowledge of that, and that should be always reflected in research. The second principle, really important to us, was around capacity building and network strengthening. Really wanting to use some of our budget and our funds through this as an opportunity to build skills. So we did that through training peer researchers, which we can talk about, and capacity building in the sector. So including properly remunerating everyone for their time, including travel and accessibility needs, which often kind of can sound quite, well, one would assume it to sound quite basic, but I've seen a lot, both in my previous life in academia and in NEF, it doesn't always happen. And it's really important because, a lot of the people we were talking to were unable to take time off work if they weren't remunerated for their time, of course. And then the final principle was around really centering the specificities and the needs of these organizations. And really thinking about the fact that no one organization is the same, and the issues they're working on, as well as the geographical place in which they're situated, has a hugely significant impact on the challenges and the barriers that they face. Time's flying by. So just briefly on methodology. So we used predominantly qualitative research methods, as well as a large literature review in the first stages. And as I said, worked with 4 peer researchers to conduct in-depth interviews and focus groups with 98 individuals that were in 86 different buy and for organizations. And we split this up across 5 broad regions. This was, much more about a practicality of the fact that we knew we couldn't cover every region. There's kind of very pragmatic things around the costs of train travel and accessing different areas, but also these were the regions in which the peer researchers that we employed were based. So we had London in the southeast, Wales in the southwest, Greater Manchester in the northwest, Sheffield, South Yorkshire, and then Birmingham. And we split our study into two phases. So the first one was we wanted to really understand like a sectorial state of play. As I said earlier, we really appreciate that much work has gone before us on this, and we wanted to acknowledge that and take stock of that. There's no point reinventing the wheel every time we do research, and our focus was much more on the in-depth qualitative work in the second phase. So we myself and research colleagues at NEF conducted some interviews with 3 funders and 5 what were called leaders in Biome4 organizations. So these are people that have been in the sector for a really long time. We did a desk-based literature review and then some thematic analysis of findings that were developed into a typology in order for us to seek to answer the question of how we define Biome4 organizations, which was a very complex process and one which there is still a lot of back and forth on. There is no hard and fast kind of rule around how it's defined, and there's a lot of people involved in the sector, of course, have very strong views on this, and some of them are very opposing. And really, we wanted to come at it from understanding how we can be as expansive as possible without losing the really key principles of what the sector is about, which is about lived experience and really being embedded in communities. And then from here, we did our phase 2, which was in-depth analysis with peer researchers. So we had 226 applications, which we were very flattered by. Speaking to, the interest in this sort of work, and also how many people are engaged in Biome4 organizations and also engaged in wanting to do research. We did some research methods training with them, wanting to give them the opportunity to use creative methods. So I've got here a short list of some of the things we talked about. So photo and object elicitation, which were used in focus groups, walking interviews, really meeting participants where they were, what worked for them, being within their space, which is, really important, and other forms of visualization techniques. So each peer researcher did approximately 15 interviews and 1 focus group. And there was 92 in that phase, and then 6 in the others. That should be 90. And then each of the focus groups were conducted in the area in which the peer researcher lived, because that also helped them build connections with the people that they were interviewing and holding focus groups with, which was really important to us and really, really helped, I think, engage people in the research. Sometimes it is, I'm sure as many people know, really difficult to get people to engage in interviews and focus groups, and having that connection with someone that was much more local than the research team was really, really important for this work, particularly as we were so keen on getting so many voices involved. So just going through some of the really headline findings, and this is going to be a whistle stop, and I'm sure Suzanne, who's on the call, will have lots to add to this, and there is much more to add. There was a vast amount of data, which is always wonderful, and I think you'd rather have more than less, but it was, quite a difficult process as a researcher to think through kind of what we prioritized and what we headlined, and that kind of quite weird research guilt around research waste and not really being able to get into the depths of everyone's voice, which is something that we've been reflecting on, and we'll be writing a bit more about in terms of thinking through the process of conducting this sort of research. But headlines, there's a real feeling within the people that we spoke to, the organizations in this research, that the expertise and the opportunity of these organizations is not always seen. There's certainly been an uptick, as you can see there in the bottom left, so kind of post-COVID, in funders and policymakers recognizing the vitality of communities, and that certainly was more so the case as well after the summer of 2024. But there's much more work to be done. I think there's quite a deep discussion to be had that we don't have time for necessarily now to get fully into it, but around this concept of lived experience versus expertise and experts. So the bottom right quote there is someone talking about how everyone has a lived experience. We find that this term is being used to differentiate between experts like academics and those with actual lived experience, despite them being experts in their own lives. And I think there's a really key conversation to be had around there about what we value as expertise and how that looks in terms of you know, maybe a professionalization of a sector that doesn't necessarily fit for a lot of people that haven't been on a professional journey within the sector. So this is one of my favorite quotes that I've used quite a lot in this research, which is someone describes their experience of running a buy-in for organization as having to build the rail track whilst also having to drive the train. And this speaks to a lot of tensions around scaling up and capacity and precarity, which was a really prominent theme throughout. So precarity, both through lack of core funding, which was a huge problem around continuity and continuation funding, but also precarity around, you know, conditions in the sector and people moving in and out of jobs and you know, staff being on short-term contracts by nature of the funding and therefore, you know, needing and wanting to move on quite quickly and the impact that has on services. And another key, I'm condensing a lot of findings into a few slides here, but another key issue is around lack of operational infrastructure. So, you know, lack of resources and sometimes, you know, knowledge and experience around governance, financial processes, constitution, and the fact that for some people, being able to run a buy-in for organization and hold that governance within house is really difficult if you're working with people that have you know, different levels of capacity, thinking particularly about the disabled and deaf people's organizations that we've spoken to and how the quite stringent rules around that can become quite problematic for some organizations. And there's just a quote there from someone talking about how they have to pay a fortune to outsource payroll and admin work and as well as governance and HR, because that resource isn't in-house and there isn't the infrastructure, you know, fully rolled out across the sector. So another key finding was around, and this is, I think, a really important one for this space to talk about, is lack of flexibility in funding and reporting. And I've got another slide as well that will speak to this in a minute. But huge issues around the complexity and time-consuming nature of writing funding bids. Simultaneous to a lot of organizations we spoke to that were obviously by nature of this research very small, kind of anything from one part-time person maximum up to kind of eight to 10 part-time employed staff with a couple of full-time. So we're talking very small organizations here. So problems of the time-consuming nature of writing funding bids, the fact that that's, you know, of course, a skill in and of itself, one that people craft over many years. And then simultaneous to that, the issue of being outbid by organizations with the capacity to outsource, you know, bid writing and other things, or larger organizations being able to deliver projects for less money or with less resource, which was a really key problem. And I think a lot of people spoke about what they saw to be something that didn't really make sense to them in terms of they find, you know, a lot of people reported to us that they were writing the same amount of same length of bids or same reporting for £1,000 relative to, you know, £15,000, and there wasn't really that differentiation there. The second kind of key issue, key finding was around the creative nature of the sector. So there is the, you know, I just said some organizations reported that bigger ones are able to outbid them and do it for less. But when talking to participants about how they reflect on the projects that they've delivered and the services they've delivered, they always talk about how funders get so much more for their money with small organizations who are really embedded in the community, have less overheads, of course, but only if that flexibility is inbuilt. So some of us were talking, again, reflecting on the summer around a lot of the projects they planned to deliver shifted because they were responding to, you know, a rise of Islamophobia in their community. For example, with one organisation in South Yorkshire, they had to change completely the programme that they were offering because they needed to be reactive to their community. And they were anxious about talking to their funder about that and about what that would look like and whether or not that would impact them getting funding in the future. So, oh, sorry, I think my Teams is making noise. I hope you can't hear that. So just again on that lack of flexibility issue, when outcomes are different to expectations, so similar to the example that I just gave there around, you know, people reporting to us, and you know, there were some great examples of fantastic funders that do this already, but we're just talking overall. The general kind of themes from the comparative analysis that we did was around the issues around reporting when outcomes are different to expectation, and really having your funder having faith, the funder having faith in the organization, and the organization building trust with that funder around how they report that. And then linked to that, the difficulties that exist in reporting that. So we talked a lot about power dynamics in the sector. So, you know, there was one group, a Black-led women organization, that were talking to us around, you know, how it feels to them to have to go to funders and report issues that, you know, maybe a project didn't go as well as it did, and they're talking to, you know, a white middle class person that has very different power dynamics to them and holds funding power over them. And so we talked a lot about the intersections of these, you know, racialized, class, gendered dynamics that are really important to think through in terms of how we engage, how funders engage with the sector, and how the sector engage with funders and policymakers, of course, more broadly. So I've brought this one up here, which is, I think, just important for this space to think through. And this was also something that in the first phase of the research, some of the funders that we spoke to brought up, which is around the health and well-being of staff, and I guess the accountability of the funding sector around that. So firstly, the need to centre care. So we've got here the process of getting to the goal is reliant on a healthy staff base. And we need to recognise, this is a quote from someone that's a CEO of a Buying For, we need to recognise the needs of staff around wellbeing. Organisations are cut to the bone and funders should support better. So I guess it's about this constant balance between wanting to do more for less, because there's that assumption that it will, you know, you're more likely to win funding for it, but also needing to pay your staff well and support them. Burnout is, you know, a very big problem in the sector. People are not just doing this as a 9 to 5, it goes home with them, it doesn't leave them, particularly as everyone that we spoke to have lived experience in that sector. So they're carrying, you know, often a lot of trauma with them, which, you know, has a big impact on their lives. And we spoke here around the question of boundaries as a barrier to change. So just this quote says, it's difficult to navigate, this is from a funder, it's difficult to navigate telling people to stop working when it's their lives. Is it ethical for white people to tell them to stop? You want people with the right experience of the problem to resolve it, but firstly, should they be solely responsible for resolving it? And it means so much that it could make them unwell. One of the, we're not going to talk through recommendations today, because we're going to release them at a roundtable in a few weeks, and I can give details of that. But one of the things that was suggested, both by people working in organisations and funders as well, was around the responsibility of ensuring that good organisational practice goes on in organisations. Now, of course, there's a debate to be had there around agency and the role of funders in that, and often counterintuitive to kind of the idea of letting organisations have more freedom, but this idea of, you know, ensuring that organisations are paying a living wage, that there's, you know, maternity leave and sick leave policies that are fundamental. And this came up a lot, which I was quite surprised about, actually. And it was quite interesting listening to organisations talk about their wants for funders to engage with that, simultaneous to their want for more freedom. And, you know, of course, there's always tensions in those spaces. So just a note on long-term planning and strategizing. This lack of stability was incredibly prominent and a big fear throughout a lot of people. A lot of people that we spoke to are spending, particularly those that are full-time staff, are spending so much of their time feeling incredibly stressed and pressured around the long-term progress of their organization and the existence of it. So thinking about planning for the medium and long term. So one participant said to us, what's plan B? We need a 25-year roadmap and strategy, but to create this, there needs to be resource, and to deliver it, there needs to be resource. Funders must commit to helping communities create a roadmap and then implementing it. And I guess this is a bigger question around kind of how the sector operates between funders and organizations, and also, you know, where that power dynamic lies and what that looks like. But it's also a question around delivery and what long-term planning looks like. So a lot of people that we spoke to said that they previously had core funding for many years, and then suddenly a strategy changes within an organization that's funding them, and they are no longer able to access any of that funding. And of course, the need for those services still exists. So it's about, having to balance that constant fear. And I added this bottom quote because it's just, it made me laugh as someone that's presenting a research project, but I do think it's true. We need to be creating solutions, not just naming problems through more research. I'm not here to kind of say that we found anything hugely groundbreaking in the research. I think the way in which we did it and the stories and the experiences we've got are of course completely original and hugely impactful. But a lot of the people I spoke to and the peer researchers spoke to were saying that they've been having these conversations for many years, which of course we know is a problem in many sectors. Just a note on this, which came through really strongly in the focus groups when people were together in spaces. So the peer researchers ran the focus groups and we sat in on them. And I think focus groups are always a really beautiful space to be in because you see people build connections, people that wouldn't necessarily have the time or the means with which to meet each other. And also you start to see them kind of think about where their organization fits in the ecosystem. And a lot of people spoke about the power of buy-in for relative to other kind of voluntary and charity sectors being around speaking truth to power and the emancipatory possibilities of them, which is how they described their work. And their ability to advocate for their communities and create spaces that have the potential to transform lives. I think a lot of that came through, I have thousands of quotes that I could have put on these slides, but I didn't. But a lot of that comes through people just talking about the fact that they know exactly what the people that are coming to their organization are going through because they've been there before, and being able to respond to that, with care, and actually, genuinely showing that they do care, which is, sounds quite a mundane thing, I guess, or quite an everyday basic thing to say, but that became really clear when we spoke to service users as well, that then became volunteers or worked in buy-in for organizations. It was that connection that was so important to them. That said, of course, vast numbers of these organizations are working at the intersections of many inequalities, and really thinking clearly about how those intersections play out. So we were having a discussion with the advisory group recently around, really wanting to show that, if you are an organization that's working with Black working class women, they're going to have very different experiences to other women. Likewise, that can be played out across all sectors, and really taking time to take stock of how those intersections play out and impact on their work, both in terms of the systems that they're fighting outside their work, but also the systems that are impacting them within their work. And as I've said here, all of those participated were seeking to overcome these. But often they felt that they were seen as, because they were trying to do that more emancipatory work, they were seen as risky to a lot of funders, and reported that often, larger, less radical, those were their words, organizations were awarded funding because there was kind of less risk seen there. Yet I think what I'd really like people to take from this, and we really want to foreground in the work, is that this perceived risk is actually, their strength, the strength of these organizations, and one which should be embraced, particularly, as I said, as we know, when, we don't have the same sorts of we don't have the same safety nets in communities as we once did. It is this risk that makes them so valuable and allows them to do the incredibly powerful work that they do in communities. And they're often described and were throughout the research as a lifeline, which, is so important. Okay, I think I've got this and one more just to end on. This was a question that came up a lot in the research around what is impact. And it's a question I always like to talk about, having worked in the university sector where people talk about impact a lot, and it is just very oddly conceived of. And so on the right, you'll see these are from our focus groups where we asked people, the peer researchers asked people to think about what impact meant to them and to write down, what that meant to them. So you've got, you've got different words here. I'll let you all read them. I won't read them all, but, really thinking about things like a reduction of stigma and connection, commonality, compassion, things that aren't necessarily tangible on spreadsheets or in terms of numbers, but really that was the strongest thing that came out. And I've just put a few quotes here that I thought were really, really powerful. Maybe the best impact isn't reflected in 1,000 words. Buying for organizations reduce stigma and perceptions of why someone has ended up in a situation, and that's a really important one. And the last one there, just in the current climate where there's a lot of systemic issues making it hard for organizations or individuals dedicated to creating initiatives that support groups, it's important to remember that all contributions, no matter how big or small, are valuable. Now, I know there's a broader conversation to be had around the fact that there are metrics that have to be used, and has to be some way of tangibly recording what impact is, but really the kind of plea from the people involved in this and their understanding of impact was wanting it to be much more expansive. And as I said, we're not going to go through the recommendations fully today, but lots of our recommendations are around what engagement looks like. And everyone we spoke to was just saying, we want funders or policymakers, whoever it is, to visit us in our space to see what we do, to really see how impactful it is. It may not translate to, big numbers, or it may not be something that is headline grabbing, but it has a huge impact on people's everyday lives, which is, of course, absolutely vital. So I just wanted to put those pictures up because I thought they captured some of the focus groups really well. Okay, I'll just end it there because, it's 35 minutes past. Just as a brief, just for you all to know that are listening, we have some planned outputs coming out very soon. So we're having a funders and policymakers roundtable, which is on the 18th of June. And then from there, we'll have a summary of the research and recommendations will be released on that. And then they'll go up on NEF's website and Lloyd's website, accompanied by a main report that will be out in July. And we will be doing some more kind of standalone outputs, particularly wanting to really make this as useful as possible for buying for organizations, thinking through many aspects of the research that I haven't had time to go through today. But there will be some outputs coming out. So I just wanted to flag that for people, if they're interested, to keep an eye out for. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.